All right, picture this. It's March 5th, 2026, and something huge is happening in the gaming world. For as long as I can remember, serious gaming meant you needed this giant, power-guzzling desktop PC, right? Well, that whole era, it's pretty much over. So let's do a deep, deep dive, a microscopic teardown, really, of the new handheld wars.
Now, that might sound a little dramatic, but honestly, it's true. I mean, think about it. When you can hold a device in your hands that packs the punch of a decent gaming PC, but barely uses any power, that changes everything. This isn't some niche little market anymore. This is the new heart of the gaming universe.
And that, of course, brings us to the big question. We've got three titans, Asus, Valve, and Nintendo, locked in this absolutely brutal fight for control. And here's the thing. They're all coming at it from completely different angles, with totally different strategies. So, who's going to win?
But to figure that out, you've got to understand this isn't just about who has the biggest numbers on a spec sheet. Nope. The real battle is being fought down at the microscopic level. We're talking about compilers, AI upscaling, and squeezing every last drop of performance out of every single millivolt of power.
And, it all kicks off with the silicon. The brain of every one of these machines is a custom-designed APU. That's a single chip that smashes the CPU and GPU together. But the challenge here is just immense. How do you cram console-level power into a little handheld without it, melting? Let's take a look at how each of these guys tries to pull it off.
Okay, first up, we've got Asus, and their, let's call it the brute force approach. The ROG Ally 2 is packing this absolute monster of a chip, the AMD Z2 Extreme. I mean, we are talking about a 12-core Zen 5 beast. When you plug this thing into the wall, it can churn out 8.5 TRZ-offs of raw power. That's basically a PlayStation 4 Pro in your hands. But, and there's always a but, right? All that power costs. When you're running on battery, at the low wattages where these handhelds live, its efficiency just falls off a cliff.
Then you've got Valve. With the Steam Deck, they went in the complete opposite direction. Their custom Sephiroth chip, yeah, it looks weaker on paper, but the genius is all in the design. See, Valve built this thing to be incredibly efficient in one very specific zone, that sweet spot between 5 and 15 watts of power. It's perfectly tuned for its 800p screen and not an ounce more. It's just a masterpiece of laser-focused engineering.
And then there's Nintendo. And as always, Nintendo is playing a completely different game from everyone else. They're not even trying to compete in the raw power race. The heart of the Switch 2 is this NVIDIA Tegra T239 chip, and it has a secret weapon, a whole dedicated chunk of silicon just for AI. We're talking about tensor cores, and what they let the Switch 2 do, well, it honestly feels like magic.
Okay, let's look at the hard data, because this is where it all comes together. If we look at all three running at the same 15-watt power target, you can see their entire philosophies just laid bare. The Ally 2, yeah, it's got the newest, fanciest CPU cores, but look down at that AI accelerator row. The Steam Deck, it has none. It's just using raw GPU muscle. The Ally 2 has AMD's XDNA engine, which is something. But the Switch 2, it has dedicated tensor cores for DLSS. That's a completely separate engine built to do one thing and one thing only. And this right here, this is the key takeaway of this whole battle. The days of just looking at raw hardware specs to see what's best are over, gone. I mean, the Steam Deck already proved this, right? Having your OS and your custom chip perfectly in sync is way, way more effective than just having a ton of raw power that's stuck fighting a bloated, inefficient system. Which, of course, brings us to the software. On a desktop PC that's plugged into the wall, who cares if the OS is a little inefficient? It's no big deal. But on a handheld that's desperately trying to survive on a battery, the OS's efficiency is just as important, maybe even more important than the hardware itself. Now, this next quote is a bit harsh, but it's also incredibly on point. See, for the ROG Ally 2, its biggest selling point, the fact that it runs Windows and can play pretty much any PC game, is also its Achilles heel. Windows 11 is constantly running stuff in the background, sending data, forcing updates. It's just a relentless drain on that precious battery and CPU power. So let's compare these two philosophies side by side. On one side, you've got Steam OS. It's built on a super lightweight version of Linux. Its Proton layer, which translates Windows games to run on it, is just a work of art. And get this, Valve even pre-compiles game shaders on their own servers so you don't get that annoying stuttering. It all adds up to this incredibly smooth, consistent experience. And on the other side, you have the burden of Windows.
It forces Asus to throw in faster, more power-hungry hardware just to try and make up for how inefficient the OS is.
Okay, so if raw power is inefficient and a bloated OS is a killer, how do you get around that? How do you escape the trap? Well, the answer is you don't play that game at all. You change the rules. And the solution is AI. Look, modern games are just too demanding to be rendered pixel for pixel on a tiny device. It's not going to happen. So the new frontier isn't about rendering every pixel, it's about reconstructing the image intelligently.
And this is the secret sauce behind Nintendo's whole strategy. It's called neural upscaling. So instead of trying to brute force a full 1080p image, which takes a ton of power, the Switch 2 renders the game in a much lower, much more efficient resolution. Then, that dedicated AI hardware, those tensor cores we keep talking about, kicks in. It uses these insane algorithms to build a beautiful, high-resolution image from that low-res starting point. It's basically hallucinating all the missing details, and it does it with stunning accuracy.
So how does this little magic trick actually work? Well, it's basically a three-step process. Step 1. The game renders internally at a really low resolution, something easy to handle, like 540p or 720p. Step 2. The AI engine grabs that low-res image and uses its neural networks to upscale it to a crisp 1080p. But here's the real kicker. Step 3. The AI can also generate brand new frames from scratch and slot them in between the real ones. This makes the gameplay look impossibly smooth. It is pure AI black magic, and it's why the Switch 2 has battery life that the others just can't touch. Now, to be fair, AMD has its own version of this called FSR, and that's what the DEC and the Ally use. But the difference between them is absolutely fundamental. You see, NVIDIA's DLSS runs on its own special, dedicated AI hardware. That means it has pretty much zero impact on the main processor's performance. AMD's FSR, on the other hand, has to run on the main GPU cores. It's fighting for the same resources the game needs, which can eat into performance and even add noticeable input lag. Having that separate, dedicated brain just for AI, it's a game-changing advantage.
But of course, a great handheld isn't just about the chip inside. The whole experience really comes down to a bunch of other crucial parts, right? Like the screen you're staring at, the battery that's keeping it all going, and the cooling system that stops it from melting.
And in this department, the other two really fight back. The Steam Deck's Samsung OLED screen is just its world-class. You get incredible HDR brightness, and because it's OLED, the perfect blacks actually help save power. But then the ROG Ally 2 hits back with a super fast 165Hz screen with variable refresh rate, and that VRR is a huge deal. It smooths out all those inevitable frame drops and makes everything look way better. Plus, to feed that power-hungry chip, Asus somehow managed to cram in a massive 80-watt-hour battery, and they've got this really advanced vapor chamber to keep it all cool and quiet.
Okay, so we've tore down the hardware, we've looked at the software, we've unpacked the AI, we've seen how differently each company is approaching this. So it's time. The final verdict. Who actually wins the war for the palm of your hand in 2026?
Well, one thing becomes really clear. The Asus ROG Ally 2, despite all its raw power, is kind of an engineering trap. It's just crippled by its need to run that bloated Windows OS. So the real fight here is between two kings, and each one rules over a very different kingdom. You've got the Steam Deck OLED as the king of today. It gives you this amazing, unfiltered access to the huge PC library, all thanks to its brilliant Linux setup. But then you have the Nintendo Switch 2, and it's the king of tomorrow. It's showing us a future that's all about crazy efficiency and AI-powered graphics. So here's the verdict. Right now, for today, especially if you care about having unfiltered, offline access to your games, the Steam Deck OLED is the undisputed champion. There's just no question. Its open system and just brilliant, efficient design make it the master of how things are done right now. But, and this is a big but, that leadership is temporary. Tomorrow belongs to NVIDIA's silicon. The Switch 2 is all the proof we need that hallucinating pixels with a dedicated AI engine is always going to be more brutally efficient than just trying to brute force them with raw power. It's just a smarter way to play the game. And that leaves us with one last big question. And it's one that's probably going to define the next decade of gaming hardware. Are we watching the end of the road for traditional rendering? Is the future of gaming not about mathematically rendering our graphics anymore, but about hallucinating them into existence? Now that is something to think about.